My name is Mark Drake. I inherited my father's warehouse, a solid piece of property that had been in our family for decades. For years, it stood as a testament to my dad's hard work. When he passed, I decided to keep it and use it to grow my small logistics business. It wasn't just a building, it was a piece of my family's legacy. But little did I know that this inheritance would soon become the center of a war I never asked for. It all began one Friday afternoon. I pulled up to the warehouse to drop off some equipment, only to find the front lot completely packed with cars. I initially thought there was some mistake. Perhaps a neighboring event had spilled over onto my property. But as I stepped out of my truck, I saw a group of people lounging near the loading dock. They looked as though they owned the place, chatting casually, sipping their drinks. Confused and increasingly annoyed, I approached them. "Excuse me," I said firmly. "This is private property. Can you please explain why your cars are parked here?" The group turned to me, their expressions shifting from surprise to indifference. One woman in particular, middle-aged with a crisp, overly enthusiastic demeanor, stepped forward. She held a clipboard and gave me a tight, patronizing smile. "Oh, you must be Mark. I'm Karen, the president of our Homeowner Association. This lot has been such a lifesaver for our community," she said, as if her words explained everything. "Excuse me?" I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. "This is my warehouse. You can't just decide to use it." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Well, Mark, the Homeowner Association deemed this lot underutilized, and our community really needed additional parking. So we decided it would be best to repurpose it. You weren't using it anyway." I stared at her, trying to process the audacity of her words. "You decided? Without my permission?" Karen's tone grew sharper. "We sent you notices, multiple ones. Perhaps you missed them? Either way, the community has voted, and the decision is final." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Final? This is private property. You can't just vote to take it over." Karen's smile faded, replaced by a condescending frown. "Mark, we're a community. You need to think of the greater good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." She turned and walked away, as though the conversation was over. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, I dug through my mail, searching for the so-called notices Karen had mentioned. All I found were a few generic letters from the Homeowner Association, filled with vague language about community development initiatives. None of them explicitly stated they were planning to turn my property into a parking lot. Furious, I decided to confront Karen and the association directly at their next meeting. The meeting was held in a local community center, a building I'd never paid much attention to until now. When I entered, the room was packed. Karen stood at the front, commanding the attention of the crowd with the poise of a seasoned politician. Her supporters hung on her every word as she spoke about progress and community unity. When it was finally my turn to speak, I didn't waste any time. "I want to address the illegal use of my warehouse," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Karen's expression hardened. "Mark, this isn't the time or place." "It absolutely is," I interrupted. "You and this association have no right to use my property without my consent. Your actions are not only unethical, but illegal." The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Karen's eyes narrowed as she tried to regain control. "Mark, the community voted. We have a democratic process. If you have issues, you can file a formal complaint." "A complaint?" I laughed bitterly. "How about this? I'll file for trespassing charges against everyone who parked on my lot, and I'll tow every single car if I see them there again." Gasps filled the room. Karen's composure cracked, revealing a flash of anger. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me," I shot back, turning to leave. The room buzzed with tension as I walked out, my determination growing with every step. The next morning, I hired a tow truck company and waited. As expected, the lot was full again. One by one, the trucks rolled in, hauling away the vehicles that had so casually invaded my property. Word spread quickly, and soon Karen and a small mob of angry residents arrived, shouting and demanding answers. Karen stormed up to me, her face flushed with rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she screamed. "Taking back what's mine," I replied evenly. "I warned you, Karen. This is private property. You don't get to make the rules here." The confrontation escalated quickly. Residents yelled, Karen threatened legal action, and I stood my ground, refusing to back down. By the end of the day, the lot was cleared, but the battle was far from over. Karen made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go easily, and neither was I. The next few days were a whirlwind of chaos. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls from furious homeowners, many of whom I'd never met. My email inbox was flooded with messages ranging from threats of legal action to outright insults. Karen, of course, was at the center of it all, orchestrating the outrage like the conductor of a vindictive orchestra. One morning, as I arrived at the warehouse, I found a freshly printed flyer taped to the door. It read, "Community notice, Mark Drake's selfish actions are disrupting our neighborhood. Stand with the Homeowner Association to reclaim our community spaces." Below it was a list of accusations, including claims that I was a hostile neighbor and profiting off the backs of hardworking residents. My anger boiled over. Karen had taken our disagreement and turned it into a smear campaign. I decided it was time to fight back, but not with threats or public outrage. I needed to hit Karen and the Homeowner Association where it hurt most, their legal overreach. I hired an attorney, Sarah, who specialized in property disputes. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had dealt with more than her fair share of cases against power-hungry homeowner associations. Sarah and I met at the warehouse to go over the situation. She reviewed the so-called notices I had received and immediately spotted several glaring issues. "These aren't legally binding," she said, flipping through the papers. "They're vague and don't provide any evidence that the community has a right to use your property. In fact, they don't even explicitly state that the parking was authorized." "So what's the next step?" I asked, eager to take action. "We file a cease and desist letter," she replied, "and we start documenting everything. Pictures of the lot, records of the cars being towed, any interactions you have with Karen or the residents. This is going to be a battle, but you have a strong case." The cease and desist letter was sent out the next day, but it only seemed to pour gasoline on the fire. Karen called an emergency meeting of the Homeowner Association, and while I wasn't invited, I heard about it through the grapevine. One of the more reasonable neighbors, an older gentleman named Paul, approached me afterward. "Mark," he began hesitantly, "I'm sorry about all this. Karen has everyone whipped into a frenzy. She's telling people you're planning to sell the warehouse to a developer who'll turn it into a nightclub or something ridiculous." I shook my head in disbelief. "That's absurd. I just want to run my business and be left alone." Paul nodded sympathetically. "I believe you, but you've got to be careful. Karen's not just talk. She's already contacting a lawyer of her own, and there's talk of taking this to court." That night, I returned to the warehouse to find a group of people gathered in the lot. At first, I thought it was just more homeowners causing trouble, but as I got closer, I realized it was worse than that. Construction workers were setting up barriers and unloading equipment onto my property. "Hey," I shouted, storming over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the workers looked up from his clipboard. "We've been contracted by the Homeowner Association to install a temporary parking structure. Got all the permits right here." He handed me a stack of papers, but a quick glance told me they were bogus. None of them had my signature, and the supposed permits looked like they had been cobbled together by someone with a printer and too much time on their hands. "This is illegal," I said, shoving the papers back at him. "You need to pack up your things and get off my property now." "You'll have to take that up with the association," he replied, shrugging. "We're just doing our job." As the workers continued unloading materials, I called Sarah. Within minutes, she had drafted a formal complaint and contacted local law enforcement. When the police arrived, Karen showed up too, acting as though she were the rightful owner of the property. "Officer, this man is obstructing a community project," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "We have all the necessary approvals." "No, you don't," I countered, handing over the bogus permits. "This is private property and they're trespassing." The officer examined the documents, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, these permits don't look legitimate. I'm going to have to ask your workers to leave until this is sorted out." Karen's face turned red with anger. "This is an outrage. You're letting him bully an entire community." "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we'll have to escalate this," the officer replied firmly. Grumbling, Karen reluctantly told the workers to pack up. As they left, she turned to me with a venomous glare. "This isn't over, Mark," she hissed. "You've made a powerful enemy." That night, I installed security cameras around the warehouse. I wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else pull another stunt without evidence. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't just vindictive, she was relentless. And if she couldn't win by bending the rules, she'd break them outright. As I reviewed the footage from earlier in the day, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. We're going to need a stronger strategy. Karen's playing dirty, and we need to be ready for anything. She was right. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a war, and Karen was prepared to do whatever it took to win. But so was I. The next week was a nightmare. The Homeowner Association's smear campaign against me reached new heights. Flyers accusing me of everything from greed to endangering the community's children appeared on every lamppost and mailbox in the neighborhood. Karen's charisma and knack for twisting the truth turned even neutral residents against me. Meanwhile, my lawyer Sarah worked tirelessly to counteract Karen's schemes. She filed formal complaints with the city, exposing the fake permits Karen had submitted, and prepared a lawsuit for damages caused by the unauthorized use of my property. But Karen, as expected, didn't back down. Instead, she escalated. One afternoon, I arrived at the warehouse to find a group of people gathered in the parking lot, chanting slogans. They held signs that read, "Drake destroys community spaces," and "Save our parking." Cameras were rolling, capturing every moment for what I could only assume was some kind of media stunt. Leading the charge was Karen, standing atop a makeshift podium with a megaphone in hand. "Mark Drake's greed knows no bounds," she shouted. "He cares nothing for the families of this neighborhood. All he sees is profit." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. My stomach churned with anger as I stepped out of my truck and approached them. "Enough!" I yelled, silencing the crowd momentarily. "This is private property. You have no right to be here, and you certainly don't have the right to spread lies about me." Karen's smirk was infuriating. "Mark, the community has spoken. We need this space, and we won't stop until you listen." "You mean until I give in to your illegal demands?" I shot back. "This is my property, Karen. Not yours, not the community's. Mine. And I won't be bullied into giving it up." The crowd erupted into boos and jeers. Karen seized the moment, turning to them with exaggerated outrage. "See? This is the man who refuses to cooperate, who turns his back on our needs. He's nothing but a corporate thug." Furious but determined not to stoop to her level, I pulled out my phone and began recording the scene. "You're trespassing," I said loud enough for the camera to capture. "I've asked you to leave, and you've refused. I'll be filing charges against every single person here." Karen's face twitched, the first sign that my words had hit a nerve. But she quickly recovered, rallying the crowd with more inflammatory rhetoric. I retreated to the warehouse, locking the doors behind me as the mob continued their protest outside. Later that evening, I reviewed the footage from my security cameras. It wasn't just a protest. Karen had orchestrated a full-blown operation. People were vandalizing the property, spray painting slogans on the walls, and throwing garbage around the lot. One of the cameras even caught a man attempting to disable the security system. I sent the footage to Sarah, who wasted no time filing a police report. The next morning, officers arrived at the warehouse, dispersing the crowd and taking statements. Karen, of course, played the victim. "This is an abuse of power," she told the officers, tears streaming down her face. "Mark is trying to silence us because we're standing up for what's right." The officers, to their credit, didn't buy her act. They warned her that further trespassing or vandalism would result in arrests. But I knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't just fighting for a cause. She was fighting for control. And she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The turning point came 2 days later. I arrived at the warehouse to find heavy machinery parked in the lot. Construction workers were already hard at work, pouring concrete and erecting scaffolding. My heart sank as I realized Karen had somehow convinced a contractor to begin building on my property again. I stormed onto the site, demanding answers. The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, shrugged. "We've got orders from the Homeowner Association," he said. "They said everything's been approved." I called Sarah immediately, and within minutes she arrived with a cease and desist order in hand. But even as she presented it, Karen appeared, flanked by a group of her supporters. "This is harassment," she declared, waving her own stack of papers. "We have every right to be here. The community voted, and the city approved it." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she examined Karen's documents. "These are fake," she said coldly. "And you know it. The police are already involved, and this stunt will only make things worse for you." Karen's composure cracked for just a moment before she regained her arrogant demeanor. "You're bluffing," she said. "This is our land now." "No, it's not," I interjected. "And if you don't leave, you'll be arrested for trespassing." The tension was palpable as the workers hesitated, looking between Karen and Sarah. Finally, the foreman signaled for his crew to stop. Karen's fury was evident as she turned to me, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Mark. You're not just fighting me, you're fighting an entire community." That night, as I secured the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's words were more than a threat. This was personal for her, and she wasn't going to let it go. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "We're making progress, but stay vigilant. Karen's desperation makes her dangerous." She was right. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a force of chaos. And the battle for my property was about to reach its boiling point. Karen had taken things too far, and I knew she wasn't done yet. After the workers abandoned the construction site under police orders, I spent every waking moment trying to anticipate her next move. The tension weighed on me, but I refused to give in. This was my property, my livelihood, and I wasn't going to let her destroy it. The next escalation came 3 days later. I arrived at the warehouse to find the locks on the gates had been changed. A bold red sign hung on the fence, declaring the area condemned by order of the city. My heart raced as I scanned the property. From the outside, everything looked intact, but the implications were clear. Karen had somehow roped city officials into her schemes. I immediately called Sarah, who arrived within the hour, fuming at the sight of the fraudulent condemnation notice. "This is beyond illegal," she said, taking photos of the sign. "The city has no record of condemning this property. Karen must have forged these documents." Before we could act, a group of residents appeared, led by Karen herself. She strode toward us, exuding confidence. "Mark," she began with mock concern, "you're trespassing on condemned property. I suggest you leave before we have to involve the authorities." "That's rich coming from you," I snapped. "This condemnation is fake, and you know it." Karen's smirk didn't waver. "Believe what you want. The community stands united, and we're prepared to take this to court if necessary." Sarah stepped forward, her tone icy. "Karen, this is blatant fraud. We have every right to pursue criminal charges against you and anyone else involved in this scam. I suggest you back down before you dig yourself into a deeper hole." Karen's supporters murmured uneasily, but she remained defiant. "Do what you must," she said, turning on her heel. "We'll see who wins this fight." That evening, I installed additional security cameras around the property, ensuring that every corner was monitored. I also hired a private investigator to dig into Karen's background and uncover any connections she might have with local officials or contractors. It was clear she wasn't working alone, and I needed to know who was backing her. The results were shocking. The investigator uncovered evidence that Karen had been funneling money from Homeowner Association funds to bribe city officials and pay off contractors. There were emails, bank transfers, and even recorded conversations implicating her in a web of corruption. It was more than enough to take her down. Armed with this information, Sarah and I filed a lawsuit against Karen and the Homeowner Association, accusing them of fraud, trespassing, and defamation. The legal battle was intense, with Karen's lawyers throwing every dirty trick in the book to delay proceedings. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and she couldn't escape the truth. The day of the court hearing was nerve-wracking. The courtroom was packed with residents, reporters, and legal representatives. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her confidence visibly shaken for the first time. Sarah presented our case with precision, laying out the forged documents, financial transactions, and surveillance footage that painted a damning picture of Karen's actions. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried to spin the narrative as one of community versus greed, painting me as the villain, but her arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Karen and the Homeowner Association were found guilty of multiple charges, including fraud and illegal property use. Despite the legal victory, the aftermath was bittersweet. Karen was removed from her position as president of the Homeowner Association and faced heavy fines, but the damage she had caused lingered. Many residents were left divided, some still believing her lies while others felt betrayed by her manipulation. As I stood outside the courthouse, I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. Sarah joined me, a rare smile on her usually serious face. "You did it, Mark," she said. "You stood up to her and won." I nodded, but I knew this wasn't just my victory. It was a lesson in standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The fight had tested me in ways I never expected, but in the end, It proved that justice could prevail, even against someone as relentless as Karen. As I drove back to the warehouse that evening, I passed by several residents who waved hesitantly. It would take time to rebuild trust and mend the rift Karen had created, but I was ready to move forward. The war was over, but the journey to healing had just begun. After the court's decision, the dust began to settle. Karen's removal as president of the Homeowner Association sent shockwaves through the community. For years, she had wielded power with unchecked authority, convincing everyone that she had their best interests at heart. But now, with her lies exposed and her supporters dwindling, the neighborhood was forced to confront the damage she had caused. The first step was restoring my property. I hired a crew to clean up the vandalism, repaint the walls, and repair the damage done by Karen's reckless schemes. As the workers labored, several residents approached me, their expressions a mixture of guilt and regret. "Mark, we're sorry for everything," said Paul, the older gentleman who had initially warned me about Karen. "We should have seen through her lies sooner." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "It's in the past now. What matters is that we move forward and make sure this doesn't happen again." Paul and a few others offered to help with the cleanup, a gesture that went a long way in mending the rift Karen had created. Slowly but surely, the warehouse began to feel like mine again. Meanwhile, the Homeowner Association was in shambles. Without Karen's leadership, the group struggled to reorganize. Several members resigned, unwilling to associate themselves with her tainted legacy. A new election was held, and this time, the residents chose someone with a reputation for fairness and transparency. The change in leadership marked the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood. Karen, on the other hand, faced her own consequences. In addition to the fines and legal fees, she was ordered to repay the Homeowner Association funds she had misused. Her reputation was in ruins, and she quietly moved out of the neighborhood shortly after the verdict. It was a fitting end for someone who had built her power on manipulation and deceit. As life returned to normal, I decided to refocus on my business. The warehouse, once a battleground, was now a symbol of resilience. Sarah remained by my side, helping me navigate the final legal details and ensuring that my property rights were fully restored. She had been instrumental in my fight, and I couldn't thank her enough. One day, as we reviewed the last of the paperwork, Sarah looked up at me with a rare smile. "You know, Mark, not everyone would have had the guts to stand up to someone like Karen. You didn't just protect your property, you set an example for the whole community." Her words stayed with me. I had fought this battle out of necessity, but the outcome had proven something larger. It showed that even the most relentless bullies could be brought down with perseverance and the right allies. Months later, the neighborhood had changed for the better. Without Karen's divisive influence, residents began working together to improve the community. They started hosting events, repairing shared spaces, and addressing issues through honest communication instead of coercion. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past, and I felt a sense of pride knowing I had played a part in that transformation. On a warm spring evening, Paul invited me to a community barbecue. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to fully reintegrate after everything that had happened. But as I stood in the park, surrounded by neighbors who now treated me with respect and camaraderie, I realized the battle had truly been worth it. Looking back, the war over my warehouse had been one of the hardest challenges I'd ever faced. Karen's relentless schemes, the legal battles, and the public backlash had pushed me to my limits. But it had also shown me the power of standing up for what's right and the importance of community when it's built on trust and mutual respect. As the sun set over the park that evening, I raised a toast with Paul and the others, grateful for the lessons learned and the peace finally restored. The fight was over, but its impact would linger as a reminder that justice, no matter how hard won, is always worth pursuing.